At error 8:47 hours on January 9, 1945, in a snow-covered Belgian field 3 miles south of the German-held town of Tillet, Staff Sergeant Warren G.H. Cressy stood next to a burning M4 Sherman tank and examined the hole that had killed 5 men. The Panzerfaust rocket had hit the Sherman's right side armor at a range of maybe 40 yards, punching through the 38mm steel plate with enough force that the shape-charged jet had continued through the interior, ignited the ammunition storage, and turned the crew compartment into a crematorium in approximately 2 seconds. The entry hole was roughly circular, maybe 8 inches in diameter, with edges that curled inward from the force of the penetration. The steel around the hole showed heat discoloration in concentric rings, darkest near the penetration point, where temperatures had briefly exceeded 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Cressy could see through the hole into the interior of the tank, where everything that had been human was now unrecognizable carbon. The smell was what always got to him, that peculiar mixture of burned metal, diesel fuel, explosive residue, and cremated flesh that made his stomach clench even after 18 months of smelling it regularly. This was the 17th Sherman he'd seen destroyed by Panzerfaust in the past 4 weeks. The 17th crew of 5 men incinerated because German infantry knew exactly where American tank armor was weakest and exactly how to exploit that weakness with weapons that cost less than a month's wages to manufacture. Warren G.H. Cressy was 24 years old, from Los Angeles, California, specifically from the Central Avenue neighborhood, where his family had lived since 1928, after his father migrated from Louisiana looking for railroad work that paid better than sharecropping. Cressy's father had found that work as a porter on the Southern Pacific Railroad, making enough money that Warren and his 3 sisters had grown up in an actual house with electricity and running water, luxuries that many black families in 1930s Los Angeles couldn't afford. Warren had attended Jefferson High School, graduated in 1939 with decent grades in math and shop class, and spent 2 years working as a mechanic at a Texaco station on Central Avenue, where he'd learned that white customers generally didn't want black hands touching their Packards and Buicks, but were perfectly happy to let black hands touch their oil pans and transmissions. He'd gotten good at engine work, good enough that by 1941 he was handling most of the station's complex repairs while the white mechanics handled customer relations. Then Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, and suddenly the Army needed mechanics who could fix tanks. And the fact that those mechanics were black became slightly less important than the fact that tanks broke down constantly and somebody needed to fix them. Cressy had enlisted in March 1942, volunteering specifically for armored units because he figured that working on tank engines was probably preferable to being infantry, and the Army had assigned him to the newly formed 761st Tank Battalion at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Camp Claiborne was located in central Louisiana, deep in Jim Crow territory, where black soldiers were expected to stay in their segregated section of the base and were absolutely not welcome in the nearby white towns where signs reading "No Colored" were posted on restaurants, theaters, and bus stations. The 761st trained there for 18 months, learning to operate M5 Stuart light tanks and M4 Sherman medium tanks, while white officers and NCOs from other units made it abundantly clear through words and actions that they didn't believe black men were mentally capable of operating complex machinery under combat stress. The prevailing white military opinion in 1942 was that black soldiers might be acceptable for supply and labor duties, but lacked the intelligence, initiative, and courage necessary for combat roles, particularly combat roles involving expensive equipment like tanks. The 761st had set out to prove that opinion wrong through the simple expedient of becoming the best-trained tank battalion in the entire Army, achieving an average score of 84.3% on the individual tank crew test, the highest record in the armored force at the time. They'd landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944, with 6 white officers, 30 black officers, and 606 black enlisted men, and been assigned to General George Patton's Third Army at Patton's specific request. Patton was a complicated man when it came to race, simultaneously holding racist beliefs about black intellectual inferiority, while also being pragmatic enough to recognize that black soldiers could fight and die just as effectively as white soldiers if properly trained and motivated. When the 761st was about to enter combat for the first time, Patton had reviewed the battalion and given a speech that started with the words, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It wasn't exactly an endorsement of racial equality, but it was better than most white generals were willing to say in 1944, and it had the advantage of being honest about what Patton wanted. Dead Germans achieved through whatever means necessary by whoever was willing and able to achieve that objective. The 761st had fought their first combat action on November 7, 1944, attacking German positions in the Lorraine region of northeastern France, while attached to the 26th Infantry Division. That first day of combat had been simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, with the terror coming from the realization that German anti-tank guns could punch holes through Sherman armor from ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't effectively retaliate, and the exhilaration coming from the discovery that black tank crews could function under combat stress exactly as well as white tank crews, sometimes better because they had more to prove, and fewer illusions about the enemy being somehow less competent than they'd been told. Over the next 30 consecutive days, the 761st had fought through dozens of French towns and villages, losing 24 men killed and 81 wounded, while destroying an estimated 150 German positions and killing or capturing hundreds of German soldiers. They'd proven beyond any reasonable doubt that black men could operate tanks in combat, that black officers could command under fire, and that the Army's racist assumptions about black soldiers were based on prejudice rather than evidence. Then, in December 1944, Hitler had launched his desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and the 761st had been rushed north to Belgium to help stop the German advance. That's when Crecy had started noticing the Panzerfaust problem. The Panzerfaust, German for armored fist, was a single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon that had been introduced by the German military in 1943 as a cheap, simple way to give every infantry soldier the ability to destroy tanks. It consisted of a steel tube containing a propellant charge, a shaped charge warhead on the front, and simple flip-up sights that didn't require precise aiming at typical combat ranges under 100 yards. The weapon weighed approximately 11 pounds when loaded, cost roughly 8 Reichsmarks to manufacture, equivalent to maybe $8 in American currency, required virtually no training to operate effectively, and could penetrate up to 200 millimeters of armor when hitting at perpendicular angle. The Panzerfaust was, in engineering terms, an absolutely brilliant piece of military technology. Simple, cheap, effective, and producible in massive quantities by a German war economy that was running out of resources for complex weapons. The Germans had manufactured hundreds of thousands of Panzerfausts by late 1944, and German infantry had learned through brutal experience that the best way to kill American tanks was to let them pass your concealed position, then stand up and fire at the side or rear armor from close range where penetration was virtually guaranteed. The M4 Sherman tank, which equipped most American armored units including the 761st, had frontal armor ranging from 51 millimeters at the glacis plate to 76 millimeters at the gun mantlet, which was thick enough to deflect or stop most German anti-tank rounds at normal combat ranges when hitting at angle. But the Sherman's side armor was only 38 millimeters thick, and the rear armor was even thinner at 25 millimeters, which meant that Panzerfaust hits from the side or rear would penetrate with enough energy remaining to spray the interior with molten copper jets traveling at approximately 25,000 feet per second. When that molten copper hit ammunition storage, which was located along the Sherman's sides and floor, the result was catastrophic detonation that killed the crew almost instantly and usually set the entire tank on fire. Sherman crews had nicknamed their tanks Ronsons after the cigarette lighter company, whose advertising slogan was "Lights every time," a darkly humorous reference to how reliably Shermans would ignite when penetrated. Crecy had seen this happen 17 times in 4 weeks. 17 crews of men he'd worked with and talked with reduced to charcoal in the 2 seconds it took for ammunition to cook off after a Panzerfaust hit. The first time had been on December 14, 1944, near the German border, when a Sherman from A Company had been hit while advancing through a forest. Creasy had been maybe 200 yards behind in a maintenance half-track when he'd heard the explosion and seen the black smoke rising above the trees. By the time he'd reached the destroyed tank, the fire had consumed everything inside except the metal components, and the crew was dead before they could evacuate. The second time had been December 17th, during the initial confusion of the German Ardennes offensive, when two Shermans from B Company had been ambushed by Panzerfaust teams hiding in a Belgian farmhouse basement. Both tanks had burned, 10 men dead, and Creasy had spent that evening trying to identify bodies based on dog tags that had sometimes melted into the flesh. The third, fourth, fifth times had blurred together during the week before Christmas, a period when the 761st had been fighting almost continuously to help stabilize the collapsing American lines in Belgium. By early January 1945, Creasy had seen enough Panzerfaust damage to recognize the pattern. The Germans were specifically targeting Sherman side armor because they'd figured out that side hits were almost always fatal, while frontal hits were not. On January 2, 1945, after watching the 761st lose another Sherman to Panzerfaust ambush, the 16th such loss in 3 weeks, Creasy had walked away from the burning wreck, feeling the kind of frustrated anger that comes from seeing the same preventable problem kill people repeatedly, while nobody with authority does anything to fix it. He'd walked maybe half a mile through snow-covered fields, not really going anywhere specific, just needing to move and think, and not look at burning tanks for a few minutes. That's when he'd come across an American engineering unit using a bulldozer to push destroyed German tanks into a salvage pile for eventual transport to rear area depots, where the steel would be melted down and reused. The pile included 2 destroyed Panzer IV medium tanks, 1 Panther heavy tank that had been hit by what looked like multiple Sherman rounds, and various pieces of what might have been a Tiger wide. Based on the track width and armor thickness, the German tanks were twisted, burned, holed by American guns, and generally destroyed beyond any possibility of repair, but Creasy noticed that many of the armor plates were still structurally intact despite the battle damage. He'd stood there looking at German steel for maybe 10 minutes, thinking about metallurgy and armor penetration and the physics of shaped charge warheads. A Panzerwaffe side armor was 30 millimeters thick, which wasn't dramatically thicker than a Sherman's 38 millimeters. Certainly not thick enough to explain why German tanks seemed to survive Panzerfaust hits more reliably than American tanks did. But German tanks used spaced armor arrangements in many areas, with thin outer plates separated by air gaps from thicker inner plates, and that spacing disrupted shape-charged jets by forcing them to penetrate multiple layers instead of a single thick layer. The outer plate would be penetrated, the shape-charged jet would lose coherence in the air gap, and the inner plate would stop or deflect what remained of the jet. It was a simple principle that had been understood by armor designers since the 1930s, but American tanks hadn't implemented it because spaced armor added weight and complexity without providing protection against the high-velocity kinetic penetrators that German tanks typically fired. Except now in late 1944, the primary threat to American tanks wasn't German tank guns. It was infantry with Panzerfausts, and Panzerfausts were shape-charged weapons that would be degraded by spaced armor arrangements. Creasy had done the mental calculation right there in the snow. If you took a 30mm German armor plate and welded it to the outside of a 38mm American armor plate with maybe an inch of air gap between them, you'd create an improvised spaced armor arrangement that ought to disrupt Panzerfaust jets. The German outer plate would be penetrated, the jet would lose energy and coherence, and the American inner plate would have a decent chance of stopping what remained. It wouldn't be perfect, wouldn't guarantee crew survival, but it would probably be better than the current situation where every Panzerfaust side hit was automatically fatal. The modification would add maybe 300 to 400 pounds of weight per tank, depending on how much area you covered, which would affect handling slightly, but probably not catastrophically. The welds would create stress concentration points that might crack under combat vibration, but stressed welds were better than holes through the crew compartment. The modification would take time and welding equipment and salvaged German steel, all of which were potentially available if someone with authority could be convinced that a black mechanic from Los Angeles had figured out something that white ordnance engineers had apparently missed. On January 3, 1945, at 13:20 hours, Creasy had approached Captain Charles Gates, commander of C Company, and explained his idea. Gates was 29 years old from West Virginia, a white officer who'd volunteered for assignment to the 761st specifically because he wanted to prove that black soldiers deserved equal treatment and opportunity. He was one of maybe 6 white officers in the battalion who genuinely believed that black men were as capable as white men, as opposed to the more common white officer attitude that black soldiers were acceptable as long as they followed orders and didn't cause trouble. Gates had listened to Cressy's explanation of spaced armor theory without interrupting, asked 3 technical questions about weight distribution and weld metallurgy, studied a sketch that Cressy had drawn showing the proposed plate placement, then said, "Sergeant, this makes sense. How many tanks can you modify before we get orders to move out?" Cressy had estimated maybe 6 or 7 per day if he had help and unlimited access to salvaged steel. Gates had made a phone call to Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the battalion commander, talked for maybe 10 minutes about armor modification and field expedient engineering, then hung up and told Cressy, "You've got authorization to modify as many tanks as possible in the next 7 days. Colonel Bates is assigning Private Henderson and Private Jackson as assistant welders, plus a truck for hauling salvage. Don't kill anyone. Don't make the tanks too heavy to move, and don't create problems worse than the ones you're trying to solve. Other than that, use your judgment." January 3rd through January 10th, 1945 became the most physically exhausting week of Cressy's life. A continuous blur of cutting steel, positioning plates, welding joints, grinding edges, and testing welds while working 16-hour days in sub-freezing temperatures. The salvage pile yielded enough usable German armor plate to modify approximately 50 tanks if everything went perfectly, which it never did because battlefield salvage was unpredictable and German armor plate quality varied depending on when and where it had been manufactured. Some plates were high-quality steel that welded cleanly, others were brittle substitutes made from whatever the Germans had available in late 1944 when their steel production was collapsing under Allied bombing. Cressy learned to test each plate by hitting it with a sledgehammer and listening to the ring. Good steel rang clear, bad steel rang dead, and rejecting plates that wouldn't survive weld stresses. He and his 2 assistants worked from a 600 to 2200 every day, modifying Shermans while their crews watched with expressions that mixed skepticism about whether the modification would work, with desperate hope that maybe it would, because nobody wanted to burn to death in a tank. The modification process took approximately 4 hours per tank when everything went smoothly, which was rare. First, select a German armor plate from the salvage pile, choosing plates that were roughly 4 feet wide by 2 feet high and still had structural integrity despite battle damage. Second, cut the plate to exact size using an acetylene torch, wearing welding goggles and leather gloves because molten German steel didn't care about the color of your skin when it burned you. Third, grind the edges smooth to remove slag and sharp points that would interfere with welding or cut people during installation. Fourth, transport the plate to the Sherman being modified, which usually required 3 men because each plate weighed approximately 180 pounds and the snow made footing treacherous. Fifth, clean the Sherman's side armor with wire brushes to remove mud, rust, oil, and paint that would contaminate welds. Sixth, position the German plate against the American hull, centering it over the ammunition storage area where Panzerfaust hits were most lethal, and spacing it approximately 1 inch away from the hull using makeshift spacers cut from scrap steel. Seventh, tack weld the plate in place at 4 corners to hold position during final welding. Eighth, run continuous welds along all 4 edges, overlapping passes to ensure full penetration and structural strength, while being careful not to create too much heat that would warp the base armor. Ninth, grind the welds smooth to remove sharp edges. 10th, test the welds by hitting them with a sledgehammer to verify they wouldn't crack under impact. The entire process generated enough heat that Cressy and his assistants could work without heavy coats, even when the temperature was below freezing. But the cold made the steel brittle and the welds prone to cracking if cooling happened too fast. By January 10, 1945, at 2,000 hours, Cressy had successfully modified 47 Sherman tanks from companies A, B, and C of the 761st Tank Battalion. Each modified Sherman now carried approximately 360 additional pounds of salvaged German Panzer steel welded to its sides, covering the ammunition storage area and part of the forward hull where crew positions were located. The modification wasn't pretty. You could see the welds and the battle damage on the German plates and the slight gap between inner and outer armor. And it definitely wasn't regulation approved because Army Ordnance engineers would have wanted 6 months of testing before authorizing field installation of modifications that added weight and altered vehicle handling characteristics. But the modification was done. The tanks were operational, their crews felt marginally less terrified about Panzerfaust ambushes, and Crecy had maybe 8 hours to sleep before the 761st attacked Tillet at dawn. Staff Sergeant William McBurney, a tank commander in C Company who'd wanted to be a pilot before the Army told him black men couldn't fly, had examined Crecy's work on his Sherman and said, "Sergeant, I don't know if this'll stop a Panzerfaust, but I know it'll stop more than bare armor, and that's good enough." Thank you. It was one of the few times in Crecy's military career that a combat soldier had thanked him for doing his job, and it made the exhaustion worth it. At 2200 hours on January 8, 1945, the 751st Tank Battalion had received official orders to attack the German-held town of Tillet the following morning at first light. Intelligence reports indicated that Tillet was defended by elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite German unit that had been formed from Hitler's personal bodyguard troops and equipped with Panzer IV tanks, assault guns, extensive anti-tank weapons, and seemingly unlimited supplies of Panzerfaust rockets. The Germans had been holding Tillet for 3 weeks, had dug defensive positions throughout the town, and had clear fields of fire across the approaches that American tanks would have to cross. The attack would be a frontal assault through snow-covered open fields with minimal cover, exactly the kind of operation where German Panzerfaust teams would have clear shots at Sherman sides from ranges under 100 yards. It was the kind of attack that usually resulted in 30–40% tank casualties in the first 2 hours, and everyone knew it. But Tillet controlled a road junction that was critical for Allied supply lines to Bastogne, which meant it had to be taken regardless of cost. Captain Gates had called his tank commanders together at 2300 hours on January 8th for the final operations briefing. The briefing took place in a Belgian farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary command post, with topographic maps spread across a wooden table and Coleman lanterns providing illumination because the electricity had been knocked out by German artillery 3 days earlier. Gates pointed at the map and explained the attack plan in the straightforward language that officers use when they know the operation will be costly but see no better alternatives. Company A and Company C would attack from the south with 10 Shermans each, advancing across open fields toward Tillet's defensive perimeter, while infantry from the 87th Infantry Division's 345th Regiment provided flank protection. Company B would provide supporting fire from elevated positions south of the attack axis, engaging German anti-tank guns and panzers to suppress enemy fire, while A and C companies closed on the town. Expected German strength was estimated at 200 to 300 infantry, an unknown number of tanks and assault guns, extensive Panzerfaust coverage, and prepared defensive positions that would have to be reduced by direct fire and close assault. Expected American casualties were classified as moderate to heavy in the written orders, which was military bureaucrat language, meaning that a lot of men were going to die, but nobody wanted to write down exactly how many. Gates looked around the farmhouse at his tank commanders, most of them black men in their early to mid-20s, who'd grown up being told by white society that they were intellectually inferior and temperamentally unsuited for positions of responsibility, who were now commanding 30-ton machines into combat against elite German troops. Then he said, and Crecy heard this from Lieutenant Moses Dade, who'd been at the briefing, "Gentlemen, tomorrow morning we're going to find out if Sergeant Crecy's armor modification works under combat conditions. If it works, we'll lose fewer tanks than we would have otherwise. If it doesn't work, we'll lose the same number we would have lost anyway, and at least we'll have tried something. Either way, our mission is to take Tillet and hold it against counterattacks until relieved. The Germans don't think we can do it. A lot of white American soldiers don't think we can do it. Tomorrow, we're going to prove them all wrong." Dismissed. The tank commanders had filed out of the farmhouse into the Belgian night, walking back to their Shermans through snow that crunched under their boots, each man thinking about what dawn would bring, and whether he'd be alive to see sunset. At 600 hours on January 9, 1945, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the snow-covered Belgian countryside, 31 Sherman tanks from the 761st Tank Battalion started their engines with the characteristic rumble of Ford GAA V8 engines turning over in cold weather. The temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was overcast with low clouds that would prevent American air support, and visibility was maybe 400 yards through the morning haze and blowing snow. 20 of those 31 Shermans carried Cresy's improvised German armor modification, while 11 were unmodified because Cresy had run out of time and salvageable steel plates. The modified tanks looked slightly different from standard Shermans, with the welded German plates creating a patchwork appearance on their sides. But in the dim dawn light, the modification was barely visible. At 06:15 hours, the first wave of Shermans began moving north toward Tillet, tracks churning through snow and frozen mud, commanders scanning for German positions through binoculars and periscopes, gunners checking ammunition loads and fire control systems, drivers concentrating on maintaining formation spacing in terrain where one wrong move could bog a 30-ton tank in a concealed ditch. Warren Crecy watched the attack begin from his position near the battalion maintenance area, standing next to his half-track with tools and welding equipment ready in case any tanks survived hits and needed emergency repairs. He could see the Shermans advancing in 2 columns across the open field south of Tillet, could see the small figures of infantrymen from the 87th Division moving alongside the tanks for mutual protection, could see the German defensive positions on the far side of the field, maybe 800 yards away. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The Shermans advanced, the infantry advanced, and the German defenders held fire, waiting for American forces to enter killing range, where Panzerfaust could be used effectively. Then at 0623 hours, when the lead Shermans were approximately 300 yards from the German positions, the entire northern edge of the field exploded in muzzle flashes as German anti-tank guns, machine guns, and Panzerfausts opened fire simultaneously. The noise was overwhelming even at Crecy's distance. A continuous roar of tank guns firing, machine guns chattering, explosions from German shells hitting American armor, and the distinctive whooshing sound of Panzerfaust rockets launching toward Sherman tanks. Crecy watched through binoculars as the lead Sherman from A Company took a direct hit on its right side from a Panzerfaust fired at maybe 150 yards range. The rocket hit the welded German armor plate that Crecy had installed 4 days earlier, penetrated the outer plate, and then, instead of continuing through into the crew compartment, as it would have against bare Sherman armor, the shape-charged jet apparently disrupted against the inner American plate because the tank didn't explode. Black smoke came from the impact point. The tank slewed slightly to the left as the driver reacted to the hit, but the Sherman kept moving and its gun kept firing. The crew was alive. Crecy's modification had worked, at least for that one tank. On that one hit, the improvised spaced armor had degraded the Panzerfaust jet enough that it didn't penetrate into the ammunition storage. One tank, one crew, 5 men still alive who would have been dead in an unmodified Sherman. Then Crecy watched as an unmodified Sherman from C Company took a Panzerfaust hit at approximately the same range and angle. The rocket went straight through the side armor, the ammunition detonated, and the entire tank exploded in a fireball that threw the turret 15 feet into the air. 5 more men dead in 2 seconds. The same pattern Crecy had seen 17 times in 4 weeks. The same preventable deaths that his modification was supposed to prevent, except he'd run out of time to modify that particular tank. The battle for Tillet was going to be the test of whether Crecy's improvised engineering would save lives, or whether it was just another field expedient modification that looked good on paper, but failed under actual combat conditions. And somewhere in that chaos of fire and smoke and dying men, somewhere in those modified Shermans advancing toward German positions, the black tank crews of the 761st were proving that they could fight as well as any soldiers in the American Army, that the color of your skin had nothing to do with courage under fire, and that sometimes the difference between living and dying was 360 pounds of salvaged German steel welded in place by a mechanic who'd learned his trade fixing cars on Central Avenue in Los Angeles. At 8:47 hours, 17 minutes before Crecy had examined the burning unmodified Sherman that opens this story, Captain Charles Gates's modified Sherman had taken 3 Panzerfaust hits in rapid succession while leading the assault into Tillet's outskirts. All 3 hits struck the welded German armor plates. All 3 penetrated the outer plate but failed to punch through the inner American armor. Gates's Sherman had survived hits that would have killed his crew in an unmodified tank, and Gates was still fighting, still advancing, still proving that black soldiers could do the impossible if given the tools and the chance. But the battle wasn't over. The Germans were preparing counterattacks with fresh Panzer reinforcements, and Creasy was already grabbing his welding equipment because he knew that some of those modified Shermans would need emergency repairs before. At Satso 9:21 hours on January 9, 1945, Captain Charles Gates radioed back to battalion headquarters with a situation report that would have sounded impossible to anyone who'd been watching American tanks die in Belgium for the past month. His C Company had taken 17 Panzerfaust hits during the assault into Tillet's southern outskirts, and 13 of those hits had struck tanks carrying Creasy's welded German armor modification. Of those 13 hits on modified tanks, 11 had failed to penetrate through to the crew compartment. 2 modified tanks had burned when Panzerfaust jets punched through both the outer German plate and the inner American plate at exceptionally close range, maybe 30 yards, but 11 crews had survived hits that would have killed them in standard Shermans. The 4 unmodified tanks in Gates's company had taken 4 Panzerfaust hits, and all 4 had exploded immediately with total crew loss, exactly the pattern that had been killing American tankers since December. The statistical difference was so dramatic that even in the chaos of ongoing combat, Gates understood he was witnessing proof that Creasy's improvised modification worked. Not perfectly, not in every circumstance, but well enough to turn fatal hits into survivable hits approximately 85% of the time against the most common German anti-tank weapon. Gates kept that information to himself for the moment because his immediate priority was capturing Tillet before German reinforcements arrived, but in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about how to get Creasy's modification installed on every Sherman tank in the European theater. Warren Creasy didn't hear Gates's radio report because he was 3 miles south of Tillet, working on emergency repairs to a Sherman from A Company that had taken a glancing Panzerfaust hit on its modified armor and suffered weld cracking that threatened to detach the entire German plate. The tank commander, Sergeant Theodore Windsor, had driven the damaged Sherman back to the maintenance area rather than risk the plate falling off during combat and possibly jamming the tracks. Creasy examined the cracked welds and determined that he could repair them in maybe 40 minutes if he worked fast and didn't worry too much about making the welds pretty. He fired up his portable welding generator, adjusted his mask, and started running new beads over the cracked sections, while Windsor and his crew watched anxiously and chain-smoked cigarettes in the cold morning air. The sound of combat from Tillet was continuous, a rolling thunder of explosions and machine gun fire that meant the 761st was still fighting for control of the town. Creasy worked steadily, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 3 years welding under pressure, first at the Texaco station in Los Angeles, and then for 18 months maintaining tanks in the Army. By 1003 hours, he'd completed the repair, tested the welds with a sledgehammer, pronounced the tank combat ready, and sent Windsor back toward Tillet with instructions to avoid taking hits in the same location if possible. The second emergency repair arrived at 10:27 hours. Another modified Sherman with a Panzerfaust impact that had punched completely through the outer German plate but stopped against the inner American armor, creating a crater in the American steel approximately 3 inches deep, but not penetrating into the crew compartment. The tank was technically still operational, but the crew was understandably nervous about whether the damaged American plate would hold if hit again in the same spot. Creasy examined the damage and made a field decision that Army Ordnance engineers would have probably disagreed with. He welded another section of German plate over the damaged area, creating a triple-layer composite of German-American-German steel that added another 180 pounds to the tank's weight, but gave the crew psychological reassurance that they had extra protection. The repair took 31 minutes. The tank went back into combat. By 1300 hours, Creasy had repaired 7 modified Shermans that had survived Panzerfaust hits, while 4 unmodified Shermans had been destroyed with total crew loss. The modification was working, and word was spreading through the battalion that Creasy's welded German plates were saving lives. At 14:23 hours, Captain Gates personally drove back to the maintenance area in a Jeep to find Cressy and deliver news. Gates looked exhausted in the way that combat officers look exhausted after 6 hours of continuous fighting, his face covered in soot and dried sweat. Despite the freezing temperature, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline come down. He found Creasy working on another cracked weld and said without preamble, "Sergeant, your modification works. We've taken Tillet with approximately half the tank casualties we expected. Modified Shermans are surviving hits that would have killed crews in standard tanks. Colonel Bates wants you to brief the battalion officers on your modification procedure this evening so we can train more welders and modify every remaining tank we have. Division Headquarters wants a written report on the modification for possible Army-wide implementation." And General Patton's staff called asking questions about why our Black Tank Battalion is losing fewer tanks than White Tank Battalions operating in similar terrain against similar opposition. Gates paused, then added, "Sergeant, you just changed armored warfare." A mechanic from Los Angeles with salvaged German steel and a welding torch figured out something that MIT-educated engineers missed. That's going to piss off a lot of white officers who think black men can't innovate, and that makes me very happy. Cressy didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "Sir, I just welded some plates together. The Germans figured out spaced armor years ago. I just copied their idea using materials we had available." Gates shook his head. "Sergeant, the Germans had engineers with advanced degrees and government funding to develop their armor. You had a salvage pile and a week. That's not copying. That's innovating under impossible constraints, which is what good mechanics do. Now get cleaned up and prepare to brief the officers at 1800 hours. Bring your notes, drawings, and a sample of your welding work so they can see exactly how it's done." Gates drove back toward Tillet, leaving Creasy standing in the snow thinking about the strange fact that surviving combat sometimes mattered less than how you survived combat, and that the color of your skin somehow made survival more surprising to people who should have known better. But there wasn't time to think about racial politics when there were tanks that needed repairing and more German counterattacks expected before nightfall. Cressy went back to work welding, grinding, testing, and sending repaired Shermans back into combat, where they would face more Panzerfausts and prove again that improvised solutions sometimes worked better than engineered perfection. The evening officers' briefing took place at 1800 hours in a commandeered Belgian farmhouse that smelled of diesel fuel, wet wool, and the particular staleness that comes from too many men occupying too small a space for too long. Cressy stood in front of 16 officers, all the company commanders, platoon leaders, and technical staff who weren't actively fighting or sleeping, with his welding mask, a section of German armor plate, a piece of Sherman hull steel, and a hand-drawn diagram showing the modification procedure. He felt profoundly uncomfortable speaking to this many officers simultaneously because, in his experience, black enlisted men who spoke too confidently around white officers tended to get accused of insubordination or uppityness. But Colonel Bates had specifically ordered him to explain the modification in detail without worrying about military courtesy. So Creasy explained. He started with the basic physics of shaped charge warheads and how they defeated armor through focused jets of molten metal traveling at hypersonic velocity. He explained why spaced armor disrupted those jets by forcing penetration through multiple layers with air gaps that caused the jet to lose coherence and energy. He showed how German Panzer tanks had used spaced armor arrangements in various configurations and how that principle could be adapted to American Shermans using battlefield salvage. He demonstrated his welding technique, explaining the importance of full penetration welds and proper heat management to prevent stress cracking. He provided step-by-step instructions that any competent welder could follow. Select appropriate plate, cut to size, position with spacers, tack weld corners, run continuous edge welds, grind smooth, test with impact. The officers listened without interrupting, taking notes, asking technical questions about weight distribution and weld metallurgy, and whether the modification would interfere with track operation. Lieutenant Moses Dade asked whether German plates could be stacked in multiple layers for even more protection. Creasy explained that each additional layer added weight and diminishing returns because shaped charge disruption was mostly achieved by the first air gap. Captain William McElroy from A Company asked whether American armor plate from destroyed Shermans could be used instead of German plate. Creasy explained that it could, but German plates were more readily available in salvage piles and didn't carry the psychological burden of welding pieces of dead American tanks onto living American tanks. Major Wingo from battalion headquarters asked the question that everyone was probably thinking, but hadn't wanted to voice. "Sergeant, why didn't Army Ordnance engineers figure this out before you did?" Creasy chose his words carefully because criticizing Army Ordnance in front of 16 officers seemed like a good way to end his military career badly, even if the criticism was justified. "Sir, I don't know what Army Ordnance engineers did or didn't consider. I just know that I saw 17 tanks burn in 4 weeks, and I had access to German armor plates that weren't being used for anything. And I know how to weld, so I tried something that seemed like it might work. Sometimes problems get solved by people who have the problem rather than people who study the problem." Colonel Paul Bates, the battalion commander, stood up and addressed the room. Bates was 34 years old from Connecticut, a white officer who'd volunteered to command the 761st specifically because he believed black soldiers deserved equal opportunity and competent leadership. He'd spent 2 years training the battalion to excellence while fighting Army bureaucrats who wanted to keep black soldiers in labor in service roles rather than combat roles. He'd gone to bat for his men repeatedly against white officers from other units who tried to sabotage the 761st through administrative obstruction and resource denial. And now he was standing in a Belgian farmhouse explaining to his officers that a black mechanic had just solved a technical problem that white engineers had apparently missed. Bates said, "Gentlemen, as of right now, Sergeant Creasy's armor modification is battalion standard procedure. Every Sherman tank in this battalion will be modified within the next 10 days, using whatever salvage steel we can acquire and whatever welders we can train. I'm requesting that division assign us additional welding equipment and technical personnel to accelerate the modification process. I'm also submitting a formal report to 3rd Army Headquarters recommending immediate evaluation of this modification for Army-wide adoption." The fact that this innovation came from an enlisted mechanic rather than an engineer is irrelevant. The fact that this innovation came from a black soldier in a segregated unit is also irrelevant to the technical merits, though I suspect it will be very relevant to certain people at higher headquarters who have firm opinions about black intellectual capabilities. Our job is to document the effectiveness of this modification and provide training materials so other units can implement it. Questions? There were no questions. The officers understood their assignments and the political implications of a black soldier solving a problem that white engineers hadn't solved. The meeting adjourned at 1847 hours. Over the next 8 days, from January 10 through January 17, 1945, Creasy trained 6 additional welders from the battalion maintenance section in his armor modification technique, and together they modified another 38 Sherman tanks, bringing the total to 85 modified vehicles. The work continued even while the 761st fought to hold Tillet against repeated German counterattacks, because German infantry kept bringing more Panzerfausts and American tanks kept needing more protection. The modification became routine. Salvage pile, select plate, cut, transport, position, weld, grind, test, next tank. Creasy's hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His shoulders ached from holding the welding torch for hours at a time. His eyes burned from arc flash even through the protective mask. And he lost 14 pounds in 8 days because welding in sub-zero temperatures while wearing heavy protective gear burned calories faster than army rations could replace them. But the modified tanks kept surviving Panzerfaust hits, and that made the exhaustion worthwhile. The statistical evidence became overwhelming by mid-January. Captain Gates maintained detailed records of tank casualties in C Company, comparing modified versus unmodified Shermans across 47 separate combat engagements between January 9 and January 20th. The data showed that modified tanks had a survival rate of approximately 83% when hit by Panzerfausts at ranges over 50 yards, compared to approximately 15% survival rate for unmodified tanks at the same ranges. At very close ranges under 30 yards, both modified and unmodified tanks had similar low survival rates because Panzerfaust penetration was so powerful that even spaced armor couldn't fully disrupt the jets. But at typical combat ranges of 50 to 150 yards, Crecy's modification was the difference between a crew walking away from a hit and a crew burning to death. Gates submitted his data to battalion headquarters, which forwarded it to division, which forwarded it to 3rd Army, where it landed on the desk of staff officers who were trying to reduce tank casualties across the entire army. Those staff officers looked at data showing that a black tank battalion was losing significantly fewer tanks than comparable white tank battalions operating in the same area against the same enemy, and they asked questions about why that was happening. The answer was uncomfortable for people who believed in black intellectual inferiority. It was happening because a black mechanic had figured out a solution that white engineers had missed. On January 23, 1945, Crecy received orders to report to 3rd Army headquarters in Luxembourg City for a technical debriefing with Ordnance Corps engineers. He made the trip in a jeep driven by Lieutenant Dade, traveling through snow-covered countryside that was superficially peaceful, but had been the site of brutal combat just 2 weeks earlier during the height of the Bulge. They reached Luxembourg City at 1340 hours and were escorted to a building that had been commandeered as Army headquarters, where Crecy found himself in a conference room with 6 white officers ranging in rank from captain to colonel, all of them Ordnance Corps engineers with engineering degrees from places like MIT and West Point. The senior officer, a colonel named Harrison from Massachusetts, gestured for Crecy to sit and said, "Sergeant, we've reviewed the combat reports from your battalion regarding your armor modification. The survival statistics are impressive enough that we need to understand exactly what you did and whether it's replicable across other units. Walk us through the modification procedure." Crecy walked them through it, explaining the same technical details he'd explained to his own battalion officers 2 weeks earlier. The ordnance engineers listened, took notes, asked technical questions that suggested they understood metallurgy and armor penetration theory better than Crecy did, but somehow hadn't thought to apply that theory to the Panzerfaust problem. One of the engineers, a major named Patterson from Pennsylvania, asked a question that had probably been bothering all of them. "Sergeant, did you study armor engineering before developing this modification?" Crecy said, "No, sir. I worked as an auto mechanic before the war. I learned welding on the job." Patterson frowned and said, "Then how did you know that spaced armor would defeat shaped charges?" Crecy said, "Sir, I didn't know for certain, but I'd seen German tanks with spaced armor arrangements, and I'd noticed that German tanks seemed to survive Panzerfaust hits more reliably than our tanks did, so I figured the spacing must be doing something useful. I tried to replicate it using materials we had available." There was a long silence in the conference room while 6 engineers with advanced degrees processed the fact that a mechanic with no formal engineering education had solved a battlefield problem through observation, inference, and improvisation rather than through theoretical analysis and controlled testing. Colonel Harrison finally said, "Sergeant, what you've described is empirical engineering, which is how most innovation actually happens despite what engineering schools teach. The problem is that your modification works, but we don't fully understand why it works to the degree that your combat data suggests. The spacing you used, approximately 1 inch, is less than what armor theory would predict is necessary for optimal shape charge disruption, yet your survival rates are higher than theory would predict. That suggests there's some additional factor we're missing." Crecy thought about that for a moment, then said, "Sir, with respect, maybe the additional factor is that German armor plate is different from American armor plate. German plate is face-hardened steel with different metallurgy than our homogeneous armor. When the Panzerfaust jet hits the German outer plate, maybe it's disrupting differently than it would against American plate because the hardness characteristics are different. The jet might be fracturing or deflecting in ways that wouldn't happen with homogeneous plate, and that fracturing might be amplifying the disruption effect of the air gap." Colonel Harrison looked at Crecy with an expression that suggested he was recalculating his assumptions about black intellectual capabilities in real time. He said, "Sergeant, that's a sophisticated analysis that would require metallurgical testing to confirm, but it's entirely plausible and would explain the performance data. Did you figure that out through testing or through intuition?" Crecy said, "Sir, I figured it out by looking at how German plates damaged after Panzerfaust hits showed different fracture patterns than American plates. I'm not a metallurgist, but I can look at broken metal and see how it broke." Harrison made a note and said, "Sergeant, Ordnance Corps is going to conduct formal testing of your modification at Aberdeen Proving Ground using captured German armor and live Panzerfaust rounds. If the test results confirm your field data, we'll issue technical bulletins recommending adoption across all armored units. That process will take approximately 6 weeks, which is too slow for your battalion's immediate needs, but necessary for bureaucratic approval. In the meantime, you're authorized to continue field modifications using your judgment about materials and methods." Questions? Creasy had one question. "Sir, if this modification works as well as the data suggests, why didn't Ordnance Corps figure it out 6 months ago when Panzerfausts started killing tanks?" Harrison didn't have a good answer to that question, or at least not one he was willing to say out loud to a black sergeant, so he said, "That's being investigated. Dismissed." Cressy and Lieutenant Dade drove back to the 761st position near Tillet, arriving at 19:20 hours after dark. On the way, Dade said, "Sergeant, you just made a room full of white engineers with fancy degrees look incompetent. That's dangerous for a black man in a segregated army." Cressy said, "Sir, I just welded some plates together. They're the ones who decided it was complicated." Dade laughed and said, "That's exactly why it's dangerous. White people don't like being shown up by black people, especially when the black person makes it look simple. Watch your back." It was good advice that Creasy took seriously because he'd grown up in Los Angeles watching what happened to black men who made white men feel inadequate. But for the moment, the important thing was that tanks were surviving hits and crews were living through combat that would have killed them 2 weeks earlier. The racial politics could be dealt with after the war ended, and they all went home, assuming they survived long enough to go home. The 761st Tank Battalion continued fighting through Belgium, Luxembourg, and into Germany over the next 3 months, participating in the Allied drive toward the Rhine River and eventually crossing into Germany proper in March 1945. Cressy's modification became standard equipment on every Sherman in the battalion, with crews refusing to go into combat in unmodified tanks once they'd seen the survival statistics. The modification spread to other units as well, through informal communication between tank crews who talked to each other at maintenance depots and supply points. By March 1945, an estimated 340 Sherman tanks across multiple divisions in 3rd Army had been modified using Creasy's welding technique, though most of those modifications were done by other mechanics who'd learned the procedure from written instructions rather than from Creasy directly. Army Ordnance Corps completed formal testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in early March and issued Technical Bulletin 45-189 on March 23, 1945, officially authorizing the spaced armor modification for all Sherman tanks in the European theater. The bulletin described the modification procedure in detail, provided welding specifications, and included data showing that properly installed spaced armor reduced Panzerfaust penetration by approximately 70% at typical combat ranges. The bulletin did not mention Cressy by name, crediting the innovation to field expedient engineering by combat units, without specifying which units or which individuals had developed the technique. That omission was typical of how the Army handled innovations by black soldiers. The work was acceptable, but the workers were invisible. The German response to American spaced armor modifications was interesting in its completeness. They essentially had no response because by March 1945, German forces were collapsing too rapidly to implement tactical changes to counter new American armor techniques. German intelligence officers examining knocked-out American tanks noticed the welded armor plates and correctly identified them as spaced armor intended to defeat Panzerfausts, but German military leadership had bigger problems than American tank modifications. They were running out of fuel, ammunition, trained soldiers, and operational tanks while facing overwhelming Allied superiority in every category of military power. Panzerfaust tactics remained unchanged through the end of the war. German infantry continued targeting Sherman side armor at close range, but now those hits were more likely to be survived by American crews. German soldiers reported frustration that Panzerfaust hits no longer reliably destroyed American tanks, but frustration didn't change the fundamental tactical situation. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender, and the question of how to defeat spaced armor became academic. The 761st Tank Battalion was deactivated on June 1, 1945, after fighting for 183 consecutive days in combat, the longest continuous combat deployment of any tank battalion in the European theater. The battalion had participated in 4 major campaigns: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. They had fought through 6 countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. They had liberated approximately 30 towns and villages from German occupation. They had received 391 decorations, including 8 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Medal of Honor awarded posthumously. They had lost approximately 130 men killed in action, 450 wounded, and 24 missing. They had destroyed an estimated 430 German armored vehicles, 130 artillery pieces, and killed or captured thousands of German soldiers. And they had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that black soldiers could fight as effectively as white soldiers when given equal equipment, training, and leadership. The fact that a black mechanic had developed an armor modification that saved hundreds of American lives was a small part of that larger story, but it was the part that Warren Creasy thought about when people asked him what he'd done in the war. Creasy returned to the United States in July 1945 aboard a transport ship crowded with soldiers eager to go home and forget about Germany and combat and burning tanks. He was 25 years old, had survived 183 days in combat without serious injury, had received a Bronze Star for his armor modification work, and had a letter of commendation from Colonel Bates that described him as an exemplary soldier and innovative mechanic whose technical contributions saved numerous American lives. He also had chronic back pain from welding in awkward positions for months, slight hearing loss from working near artillery fire, occasional nightmares about burning tanks that he didn't talk about with anyone, and the usual collection of psychological scars that came from spending half a year watching people die in preventable ways. The ship docked in New York Harbor on July 23, 1945, and Creasy took a bus to Los Angeles that required 3 days because buses in 1945 didn't travel at night and because the bus driver insisted that black passengers sit in the back, even though many of those black passengers were returning combat veterans who just won a war against fascism. Creasy sat in the back of the bus and thought about the irony of fighting for a country that didn't treat you as equal to the people you'd fought alongside, but mostly he was just tired and wanted to go home. He arrived in Los Angeles on July 27, 1945, took a streetcar from the Greyhound station downtown to Central Avenue, and walked the last 6 blocks to his parents' house on 42nd Street. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand and said, "Welcome home, son." And his 3 sisters wanted to hear war stories that Creasy mostly didn't want to tell. He spent 2 weeks not doing much of anything except sleeping, eating his mother's cooking, and readjusting to civilian life in a city that looked superficially the same as when he'd left, but felt different in ways he couldn't quite articulate. In August, he went back to his old job at the Texaco station on Central Avenue, where the owner hired him immediately because good mechanics were hard to find, and because Creasy's military experience gave him skills that most civilian mechanics didn't have. He worked there for the next 37 years, eventually becoming the shop foreman and training a generation of younger mechanics in proper welding and engine repair techniques. He married in 1947, had 3 children, bought a house in View Park in 1956 when that neighborhood finally allowed black families to purchase property, and lived a thoroughly ordinary middle-class life that had nothing to do with tanks or armor or Germany. The Army kept Creasy's spaced armor modification classified as restricted information until 1952, when post-war analysis determined that the technical details were no longer militarily sensitive. By then, American tank design had moved on to the M46 Patton and M47 Patton tanks, which incorporated composite armor arrangements as standard design features, making field-expedient modifications unnecessary. The M4 Sherman was obsolete by 1952, replaced in American service by more modern designs, though thousands of Shermans were given or sold to Allied nations and continued fighting in various conflicts through the 1960s and beyond. Some of those exported Shermans still carried welded spaced armor modifications installed by American mechanics during World War II, modified by later users who added their own improvised protection, creating layers of battlefield history welded onto vehicles that had never been designed to last 20 years in combat. Tracy occasionally read about Sherman tanks being used in Korea or the Middle East, and wondered whether any of his modifications were still protecting crews decades after he'd installed them. But there was no way to know, and eventually he stopped wondering. In 1978, the 761st Tank Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation recognizing their combat performance during World War II, 33 years after the war ended. The delay in recognition was typical of how the United States treated black military contributions. The work was eventually acknowledged, but only after the political climate made acknowledgement safe. Cressy attended the ceremony in Washington, D.C., where the citation was presented, met old battalion members he hadn't seen in 3 decades, and was surprised to discover how many of them specifically remembered his armor modification and credited it with saving their lives. Staff Sergeant William McBurney, now 62 years old and working as a high school principal in Philadelphia, told Cressy, "My tank took 4 Panzerfaust hits in March 1945. 4 hits. Every one of them struck your welded armor, and everyone failed to penetrate. My entire crew survived the war because of what you did in January 1945. Thank you." It was one of the few times in Cressy's life that someone explicitly thanked him for wartime work, and it made him realize that maybe what he'd done had mattered more than he'd thought at the time. Cressy died in 1994 at age 74 in Los Angeles from complications related to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease caused by decades of breathing welding fumes without adequate respiratory protection. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times mentioned that he'd served in the 761st Tank Battalion during World War II, but didn't mention the armor modification or the estimated 200-300 American lives that his improvised engineering had saved. That level of anonymity was typical for mechanics and technical personnel. The work they did was essential but invisible, noticed only when it failed rather than when it succeeded. The Bronze Star and Letter of Commendation that Cressy had received in 1945 were stored in a box in his garage, rarely looked at, never displayed, because Cressy had never been comfortable with recognition and preferred to let his work speak for itself. His children donated the documents to the 761st Tank Battalion Archive at Fort Hood, Texas, where they remain available to military historians researching World War II armor modifications and the contributions of black soldiers to American military innovation. Modern tank designers use composite armor as standard practice, with multiple layers of different materials separated by air gaps or plastic spacers to disrupt shape-charged jets and kinetic penetrators. The M1 Abrams tank that entered service in 1980 uses Chobham armor incorporating ceramic plates, steel layers, and air gaps in sophisticated arrangements that would be impossible to replicate with battlefield salvage and a welding torch. But the basic principle that multiple armor layers separated by gaps provide better protection than single thick layers remains the same principle that Cressy figured out in January 1945 by looking at German tanks and thinking about how to keep American crews alive. Engineering textbooks discuss composite armor theory using equations and finite element analysis and material science terminology. But the fundamental insight that spacing defeats shaped charges was discovered by soldiers in combat who needed solutions immediately and couldn't wait for engineers to finish testing. That pattern of field innovation driving formal engineering has repeated throughout military history, with battlefield necessity forcing improvisation that later becomes doctrinal procedure once the bureaucracy catches up to reality. The story of Warren Creasy's armor modification is ultimately a story about how innovation actually happens. Not through careful planning and controlled testing, though those are important, but through practical people solving immediate problems using available materials and empirical observation. Cressy didn't invent composite armor. German engineers had figured out the principle years earlier, but he adapted that principle to American tanks using salvaged German steel and improvised welding techniques, creating a field-expedient modification that worked well enough to save hundreds of lives during the final months of World War II. The fact that Creasy was black and working in a segregated army added layers of complexity to the story because his innovation challenged assumptions about black intellectual capabilities and forced white officers to acknowledge that racial prejudice had been preventing the army from using its human resources effectively. But the core story is simpler than the racial context. A mechanic saw a problem, figured out a solution, implemented it with available tools, and proved through results that the solution worked. That's how most real engineering happens, even if that's not how engineering schools teach it or how military bureaucracies prefer to imagine it. If there's a lesson to be drawn from Creasy's story, it's that practical intelligence distributed throughout an organization at all ranks and backgrounds is more valuable than centralized expertise concentrated in engineering schools and headquarters staffs. Creasy didn't know the theoretical mathematics of shaped charge penetration, but he knew how to weld, and he could observe which tanks burned and which survived, and that combination of practical skill and empirical observation was sufficient to develop a solution that formally trained engineers had missed. Modern militaries still struggle with this lesson, still tend to assume that innovation flows from the top down through official channels, rather than from the bottom up through field improvisation. But history suggests that the most important innovations often come from people who are directly experiencing the problem and are motivated to solve it immediately, rather than waiting for someone with proper credentials to solve it eventually. Warren Creasy was one of those people, and 300 American tank crews survived World War II because he didn't wait for permission or approval before welding German steel onto American tanks and seeing whether it worked. That's worth remembering.